So hey folks, and welcome to They Might Be Racing. Today what we're doing is we are swapping out the rotors and pads on a 2002 Ford Explorer. Please note this is a two-wheel drive Explorer, not a four-wheel drive Explorer. So what we're going to do today is basically remove the rotor, remove the pads, swap them out with new ones, and we should be good to go. So what we've done in advance of prepping the video is we've taken off the hub covers, loosened the lug nuts, raised the car up in the air, undone the lug nuts, removed the wheels. We've got it properly on jack stands as well as a backup floor jack to make sure that everything is nice and safe. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect the caliper, and that's a 15 millimeter bolt. It is on the back side. It's kind of hard to see, but it is on the back side. And if you're looking at it sort of from the top, you can see the top one right here, the bottom one in a matching position just below it. Sometimes you might need a little torque amplification on your wrench. What I always like to do is actually back it up just a hair, make it a hair's breadth tighter, and then go to loosen. It tends to make busting the bolt loose a lot easier. I don't know how much background noise you folks can hear, but my 3-year-old has been quote-unquote helping me all day, and he just had to go inside, and so I'm hearing a whole lot of butt hurt coming through the window. So we'll go ahead and start to loosen the lower one. Now, one of the things with these calipers is on this particular car, I don't know, maybe I've been working on British cars too long, they're very heavy. So what I found works best for this one, because you have to suspend a caliper once you take it off. You do not ever want to let a caliper hang by the brake lines. It's a very, very good way to destroy your brake lines and not be able to stop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause for a second. I'll finish unbolting this and I'll set it on top of my little trick. Now sometimes these calipers don't want to come off, so one trick is just to slide a screwdriver in at the top there and pop from the top and follow it up with one from the bottom. And what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and set it on top of the bucket. There are two lines that come off this little harness here. One is the actual brake line, the other is a sensor that goes to the back of the wheel. With caliper off, we just simply pop off the rotor, and if you can see it, you can see this has got some, wow, pretty mangled in the back. This is what happens when, I don't know how she does it, but my wife seems to do a number on brakes. The next thing to do is to use a 14 millimeter wrench on the, there are two bolts that hold the piece that puts the pads up against the the pistons. So basically what we want to do with that is bust these guys loose. And looks like I need a little bit more torque for this. So once you've got the 14mm bolts out of the back, the main part of the pistons should separate from the piece that holds the brake pads. And wow. So basically, if you can see that, she's ground that sucker right down on the metal, which explains the back side of the rotor. The front side doesn't look too good either. So, pretty shabby. Now you always want to check your pistons. The pistons themselves look okay. One of the things we want to do is we want to compress the pistons so that we can easily fit this back together again. And the trick for doing that is you place one of the brake pads against the pistons, find a good place from the back of the caliper where you're not going to do any damage to anything, and then one of the things to keep in mind is once you've done this, you're going to want to hit the brakes a couple times before you take off, because it'll take a moment or so for the brakes to reseat. Okay, got those pistons good and compressed, and go ahead and loosen this big C-clamp back up, get rid of that. So the next thing to do is to prep your new pads. So you've got your holder here. Now we're using some fancy ceramic-y ones. Basically in the kit, it comes with the shoes, four pads, four, two for driver's side, two for passenger side. New clips, retaining clips, and brake grease for the back of the pads. So first thing you do is you pop off the old clips. If for whatever reason you buy pads and they don't have these retainers, you can sort of reuse them, but it depends on what the condition of everything is. So go ahead and seat the new ones. If there's any gunk in there, clean it off. And these just press into place. They're held in by pressure. There's one. Here's the other. You just want to double check them, make sure they're seated correctly. And then I take some of this grease. This is the front of your pad. This is where it connects with the rotor. This is the back of the pad. Grease goes on the back. It's to cut down on the brake squealy noise that is made from when you hit the brakes from the pistons and such. Just rub a little bit of that on the back. Do that with the other pad. Now never ever put grease on the other side, because that will basically keep you from being able to stop. Again, spread a little grease across there. The next thing you need to do is fit them, come in at a bit of an angle, and then the tabs at the bottom are actually what hold these in place. They can be a little fiddly. Sometimes it's a bit of a balancing act to keep them in there. Go ahead and fit the second one. This sort of stuff is always a little bit embarrassing because I can do it a million times until I turn the camera on, and then all of a sudden something very simple is very difficult. So we've got those back in there. So what we want to do is we want to bolt this back up to the piston assembly. So just set it on top of the bucket, set the piston assembly over it. And since you compress the pistons, it should go on fairly easily. Take your two 14mm bolts. Fit those. And then we're going to tighten it up. Now the reason why I like having the bucket here is it kind of gives me like a little workspace to mess around with the caliper, and I don't have to hang it up, and I don't have to be flipping it around or any of that other stuff that can be a pain in the bucket, particularly with this type of setup versus, you know, sort of a solid unit. And sometimes the pads will pop out, so you just gotta reset them. Again, you want to be careful, because if you get any grease on your fingers, you don't want to get grease on the pads. So now that we've done that, let's get the rotors. And just to give you an idea of lifetime, I'm pulling these rotors off of a car with 160,000 miles, and I'm willing to bet if I really wanted to, if I could find a shop around here that still does it, I could probably get those rotors turned without any trouble. So, the problem with getting things like rotors turned is there are fewer and fewer shops around that still do it. So here you've got your new rotor. Now, all rotors are covered with a very, very thin film of oil. It's to keep the rotor from rusting in storage. Take a little brake cleaner and a rag. And what you want to do is you want to wipe the braking surface, both front and back. You'll actually see it come up all dirty. That's the protective oil. So once that's done, fit the rotor into place. Because this is a two-wheel drive system and not a four-wheel drive system, the rotor's kind of floats there. And it's all bound up by the wheel and the caliper. Now, this is probably the most fiddly aspect of doing this, and that is getting the caliper back on the rotor and getting it bolted into place. Okay, so now we have the caliper back over the rotor. So what you want to do is kind of press the rotor up as much as possible, and it's easiest if you can get the top bolt in to the back of the caliper and threaded first. Well, it's also sometimes easier said than done. And get your bolt in on the bottom. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just take a second and tighten this up using my 15mm wrench. Okay, now that we're all tightened up, we're basically done. Just give all your bolts a double check. The two 15s that hold the caliper in place, and then the two 14s that hold the pads to the caliper. From here, you always do both sides of the car at the same time. So from here, you go ahead and do the other side of the car. Put your wheels back on, tighten everything up with the lugs, lower the car back down to the ground, do the final tightening on your lug nuts, and you're basically ready to go. As always, when you're testing something, especially safety equipment like brakes, go easy on it. You need to bed the pads, bed the rotors, but otherwise that's it. So in the space of roughly half an hour, you can do your front brakes.